I'm now going to be asking questions that the audience submitted, and I'll just do them in the order that I have them here. So the first one is for Ms. Bassett.
And when you have a governor who leads the charge, they can take care of the red tape, make sure there's a good rebate program, make sure, so that the consumer, you don't need to, you just take out a loan, and then obviously the rebate program works that the money that you save each month goes to pay off that loan, and then the loan is paid off in a 7-year period. So just to set up those programs, and those haven't been established here, and that's how it's going to work. We think that, if the governor takes us on, which we do think if we show thousands of people across Colorado, and the great thing about this, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, it's across the political spectrum, it's the interest of the state. And so showing those diverse constituencies and showing the range of support across the state, we think will have him champion it, and then we'll be able to move forward. And as I say, it's just the key is the rebate programs, the tariffs, and setting up the appropriate programs so that it works.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Ms. Gonzalez, and it's somewhat related in that if we're going to have 1 million solar roofs, this says, how has the demographic you work with responded to the growing green collar industry? How has this demographic responded to educational opportunities within the sector with regard to manufacturing, construction, and so forth?
So in 2011, we actually had someone whose full-time job was linking people with jobs, really. We generally aren't a direct service organization, but this was someone who now works at one of the local unions that was helping match people up with training and then work. The problem is that some of this industry is so rapidly changing that by the time people got trained, sometimes the job had changed. And that's okay, but what we're more concerned about is instituting long-term training programs. So if you call Excel and they come out to your house, it's usually a union worker who comes to your house, so it means that they're getting usually paid a livable wage and they have access to benefits. And if you call, I call the solar company to see about getting panels on my roof, and they're usually smaller companies that can't offer the same kind of benefits. And so we would love to see the kind of infrastructure, like a giant company like Excel has, where people have ongoing access to training as well as benefits and good wages. So I think that we did a good job of matching people up, but there's still a lot of work to do as far as long-term planning.
Thank you. This next question is for Ms. Hannah or Ms. Frank. I like that you focus upon building renovation. What level of energy goal, i.e. percentage of carbon reduction, do you target in a renovation?
I like how you guys ask all the ladies first. We target excuse me 1 minute, let me get the facts straight. We target a 40% reduction of the ASHRAE baseline. So if our existing building energy use is up here, because obviously we have a lot of energy hogs, then the ASHRAE baseline is here. We then target a reduction of 40% below the ASHRAE. And we're able to do that because a lot of our buildings are daytime occupancy that we're focusing on renovation right now. We haven't had those same strides with our barracks as of yet, but so that being said, we're doing things like LED light fixtures, we're doing task lighting, passive cooling. We're really getting away from air conditioning spaces now as far as part of our major renovation. We're doing a kind of a neat passive cooling like web system. So it's sort of like those heated floors, the radiant flooring system. We're able to get something similar with our cooling and heating, and also utilizing a dedicated outdoor air system.
Great. The next question is for Mr. Weaver. We have to make sure the guys don't feel left out. You mentioned that you say we are getting there. Do you think that there, which is a target, is aggressive enough to save a livable climate, or are the goals just convenient benchmarks, which are just to make us feel good?
Well, I think the sort of goals that have been set at the state level and at the community level, as in Fort Collins, is 20% below 2005 levels by 2020 and 80% below that by 2050. I think that everyone recognizes that the numbers that Chuck cited early on, that we're already at 400 parts per million, that's higher than some folks 10 years ago were hoping we would ever get to. So, it's not to say that there's a need to push aggressively over the long term, but I think what communities face and what communities face is, despite the desire to move aggressively, one still finds that you seem to only be able to move so fast. And so I think, we're, as I cited before, our goal was 20% by 2020, and we're already at 4%, so we're hoping that we can, in fact, that communities can perhaps go faster than they've pushed themselves. So I think we started with some goals in 1999 and 2003, and in fact made them more aggressive. The community decision-making process made them more aggressive a few years after that. So I think it's the sort of thing that needs to continue to be adjusted, and it's at the community level, it's our citizens that probably have the greatest ability to push that harder. As I said, for our utility, we respond to local policy. That is the connection that's made with a municipal utility. So we all should be pushing as hard as we can.
Thank you. This next question, I guess, follows up on that for Mr. Kramer. It says, as a utility company, how can you accelerate the move away from fossil fuels to clean renewable energy? In other words, why would you be fighting the renewable energy standard?
Why are we fighting it? Our problem with the legislation that's passing through the legislature as we speak is not that it promotes more renewables. When the 10% renewable standard, current 10% renewable standard on cooperatives was passed in 2007, we were at the table, we agreed to it. It was a reasonable goal. And really, most importantly, that was a negotiated piece of legislation. It's the way public policy should be developed. All the affected policies were brought in, all the affected players were brought into a room, everyone discussed it. They took the time to figure out what was reasonable, what was possible. They took the time back in 2007 to understand our business model and how it worked. And they were smart enough to look at us and look at Excel and say those are two very different business models. So we're gonna have different tiers, a different standard for different business models. So we're not opposed necessarily to renewable standards if we are brought in and asked about it and are part of the discussion. And at the time, it was 2007, we had a 10% mandate by 2020. So we had 12 or 13 years to meet the standard. What's happened this year is that there was a bill conceived by urban legislators without any input from rural constituencies, without any input from cooperatives. And the bill was to raise the standard from 10% to 25%, but to keep the 2020 deadline in place. So now all of a sudden it's a 150% increase in only 6 years. So twice as much work in less than half the time. It's not feasible. There seemed to be a real lack of understanding about how renewable power is developed, how it's brought on the grid, the other infrastructure needed to make it possible, such as transmission lines and additional gas-fired plants to back up the renewables. So our problem really was with this particular bill, the way it was put together, the way it was rushed through the legislature late in the session, the way nobody that it would impact was involved in the negotiations, and then just simply the unreasonableness. I mean, there's a lot of engineering and science in the utility industry, and those principles need to be discussed before you can just say, oh, you should use more of this or more of that. We wouldn't want an 80% coal standard either. We don't want somebody telling us how much of each fuel we have to use, particularly when they're not considering all the ramifications and all the sort of science and engineering behind how it works.
Thank you. Okay, now this question is for Dr. Kutcher. What is the most cost-effective form of renewable energy that can compete with fossil fuels, and when do you think it will be affordable? And this question says for developing countries like China and India, but I think we could even ask, in the United States, since that's some of the concern here with moving some of the local utilities to more renewables as well.
Well, certainly, the most affordable thing to do is energy efficiency. There's no question about that, and that maybe in my closing argument, I'll get back to that. In terms of the renewable sources, wind energy is, very, very close, depending on the wind resource. It's very close to grid electricity. Even photovoltaics, in certain circumstances, is getting very, very close, and that's because the Chinese have managed to drastically reduce the price of PV modules. You probably heard the thing about Solyndra, the loan guarantee from the government going to Solyndra going out of business. The reason you see PV companies going out of business is because the Chinese have been shipping very, very low-cost PV modules out, and so PV has come way down in cost. And so the trends are all very, very positive. We're seeing all the renewable sources drop in price. The area I work in, concentrating solar power, is probably still one that we need to bring the cost down further on, but we're making progress there as well. I would say geothermal power is also quite close to grid electricity prices. The problem with geothermal is that we've sort of run low in terms of the resources, in terms of the hot water and steam resources available left in the U.S. And so now we're looking at what's called hot dry rock, drilling deeper wells. That's more expensive. But when we've done studies and looking at what it'll cost to get renewables into the grid, in general, wind is the cheapest. Although again, I think we may have to revise some of those numbers based on what we're seeing with PV prices.
Thank you. And Mr. Tignano, how can Denver work with Excel to move to renewables at a faster rate than 30% in 2020? Excel Energy.
The premise of the question is that that Excel is the only source that we can work with. And as I mentioned earlier, we in the Office of Sustainability, we're systems thinkers, so we like to not look at individual vehicles or individual energy types of production. We really want to look at the entire system. And I would not want to get locked into Excel as the only possible means of reaching our goal of 50%. We obviously will work with Excel, and a city always has a complex relationship with its investor-owned utility. They're kind of partners and adversaries at the same time. But we also want to explore all the other avenues that we have available to us. We are trying to remove and continue to reduce barriers to the installation of solar power. One example is, we just last week had our first groundbreaking for a solar garden. Solar gardens are opportunities for people who do not themselves own real estate, where they can put solar collectors to nonetheless invest in solar collectors themselves that are in kind of, you might call it a group home for solar collectors. One of the issues we've discovered is that under Colorado law, if you lease out a portion of a property that's zoned residential for a solar garden, you change the tax structure of that property and the tax goes up. So one of the things we want to do, and we can do this entirely apart from Excel, is to change the law within Denver County so that if you put a solar garden on property that's zoned residential, the tax does not increase. We're kind of looking at those level of administrative details to try to get to our 50%. We will work with Excel, but we will also look for a lot of opportunities for things that we can do on our own.
Great. Some of these next questions are for more than one person. So this is for Mr. Weaver and Mr. Kramer, so you each get 2 minutes to answer this. What is the difference in water use between coal, gas, and renewables? You can arm wrestle for who gets to go first.
As I mentioned early on, I tend to work in the trenches related to efficiency and actually rooftop solar and that sort of thing. And I don't know that I'm qualified to answer that question. I'm going to pass.
Ask you a different one.
I have one handy dandy statistic at my fingertips that'll answer part of the question. And this is what I will just read it and not pretend like I know it off the top of my head. In 2010, thermoelectric power generating plants, meaning those powered by coal or natural gas, consumed approximately 76,600 acre-feet of water for cooling and other operations. Sounds like a big number, but it's less than 0.5% of the total amount of water diverted for beneficial use in Colorado. So for comparison's sake, that's 1/12 the amount of water diverted for recreational use in the state, and 1/182nd the amount of water diverted for agriculture. So basically 182 times as much water is diverted for agriculture as for thermoelectric power generation in Colorado. So it's, for what you get for that amount of water, you get basically 87% of the state's electricity if you count the power we get from coal and natural gas. So it's actually a pretty good bargain. I know there are solar technologies that use water. Concentrated solar, I believe it's called. I'm not an expert on that. It uses water. I don't know. And it's kind of an apples to oranges comparison anyway, I imagine. You can't just say, well, this uses this many acre feet and this uses this many. You have to look at how many megawatts or megawatt hours it generates per metric ton or whatever you want to use. So I don't know, but I also think if you're going to look at renewables and the total impact of renewable energy, same with coal or natural gas, you have to look at the whole life cycle. Solar panels, wind turbines are made of metals and chemicals, and those things need to be mined and processed, and there's water used in that as well. Obviously, a spinning wind turbine, once it's up and done, doesn't use much water or any water, but the manufacturing process behind it uses water. So I think if you were going to have a real comparison, somebody smarter than me would have to crunch all those numbers to have an adequate comparison.
Okay. I have a different question for Mr. Kuchar. So I don't know if NREL's done any life cycle work on water for renewables or different energy sources.
We've done a lot of work on water consumption. I guess the first thing I would do is reiterate what Drew just said, and that is that if you look at how much water a power plant uses, it's tiny compared to agricultural use. I mentioned this concentrating solar power plant, a parabolic trough plant that's being completed outside of Phoenix, 250 megawatt plant. That's a big plant. I mean, our biggest plants really are these 1,000 megawatt nuclear plants, and this is about the quarter of the size of that nuclear plant. And it was built on agricultural land, and it uses a very tiny fraction of the amount of water that was used for the agriculture for something of much, much higher value. The value of the electricity is way higher than the value of the crops from that land. So you not only have decreased the amount of water consumption, but you've increased greatly the value that you get out of that water consumption. Now, the other thing I should mention is, basically these power plants do not need to be water cooled. And so, for example, a typical concentrating solar power plant, and we've done studies on this, if you would like to air cool it rather than water cool it, you'll increase the price of the electricity from that plant by somewhere between 3% and 8%. It really depends on which particular climate you're located in. So in the most difficult climate, you'd increase the price by 8%. So you can air cool these plants, and it does add somewhat to the price of electricity, but it's by no means a showstopper.
Okay, thank you. This question is for Ms. Bassett and Mr. Tignano. Colorado's population continues to grow. We can't reduce our carbon footprint unless we address population growth on a local, national, and global level. How do we tackle the difficult issue without being xenophobic? Is population growth being discussed by your agency or organization? Ms. Bassett.
Okay. The fact of the matter is that a city really cannot prevent population growth of the city. We don't, we have the U.S. Constitution with its guarantees of freedom as well as protection of the federal right to govern interstate commerce. So we can't put walls up at the boundaries of Denver, and nor would we want to. We do not have any plans or intentions to try to control the growth of population in Denver. We assume that the population will grow, and that is one of the reasons why when we created these 2020 goals that I mentioned, we decided to base numeric goals on absolute numbers and not per capita numbers. Because obviously one way you can reduce per capita numbers is just to increase the number of capitas. You know, if you have more people and you're using the same energy, you can say, look, our per capita energy consumption is down. But from the point of view of nature, from the point of view of the processes that affect climate change, we really haven't changed anything. So we are assuming that our population will grow, and we are adjusting our policies to assume that we have to, in order to meet the absolute numbers we want, we have to produce efficiencies that grow at a rate faster than the rate of population growth in Denver.
And then it's not obviously an issue we work directly on, but it is about sustainability, and it's the footprint that we leave. So yes, we are going to grow, and it's how do we make sure that's done in a sustainable way. So getting to what Jerry was talking about.
Okay, so this question's for Ms. Gonzalez. And it seems they checked you, but I don't know whether this is something you feel like you're a specialist on, but you can we expect any action on clean energy or climate change from DC, or will it have to happen at state, local, and, you know, NGO level?
And I actually also wanted to comment on population, because we think a little bit about that. And we actually think about it more in terms of density. So as we're working, when we're thinking about housing, as we're working with Dr. Cog, the Denver Regional Council of Governments, density is something that we've tried to increase, because we're probably not going to build a wall, but hopefully we can get people to live closer together and share some more stuff. As far as national versus state level, so we're an organization that is focused on the region and in some cases the state, but we're part of a national partnership, and so a lot of the things that we think about is how can, and I think this is probably your case too, is how can different cities and different regions work together on similar policies so that we turn a tide. You know, that if we're doing it, Seattle's doing it, and you know, Los Angeles is doing it, then maybe that's how we see change at a national level. That's our approach.
Mr. Weaver, since I asked you a question that you couldn't answer, here's one that you might. What are your thoughts on the concept of islandable microgrids on a community scale with community control and oversight? So some examples might be colleges, corporate campuses, neighborhoods, maybe even Army bases.
One of the things that Fort Collins Utilities is embarking on, as other utilities around the country, is grid modernization, advanced meters, and advanced control. And so I think this question is getting at some of the issues that are going to be out there for higher penetration of dispersed generation. You know, can things like campuses and certain electric load centers in a community operate as an island? How does the utility grid surrounding that interact? How do you cut in and cut out? I think that the initiative that Chuck mentioned at NREL, the Grid Integration Lab, if you will, these are all technologies that need to be, and understanding needs to be developed in this area. Certainly, I think Fort Collins' interest in the investment that they're making on new meter infrastructure and communication is trying to anticipate the need for these somewhat more sophisticated interactions. And just really, as many of you I imagine have the sense, you know, the traditional grid in this country in most places is pretty unaware from the power plant out to the end consumer what goes on in between. So in order for these for more interaction to occur with variable resources like solar in the community and whatnot, it is going to take a new notion of the controls and such that are involved. So I think that communities in the country like Fort Collins and others are trying to push forward on this front. It does entail investment in new systems and new training and that sort of thing. I think, over time, perhaps the next decade or so, you'll see a lot more of that in the utility industry.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
And then I just wanted to say that as a follow-on to Mr. Weaver's comments, we at Carson in 2012 launched a SPIDERS program, which was a microgrid that incorporated our our high-use, high-security, high-importance buildings on Carson. And right now, that spider grid is on a generator backup, but eventually, our goal is to tie it into a renewable energy backup.
Great. Well, I have only 2 more audience questions, and I've asked everybody one, so I guess I'll just read these 2, and if anybody in particular wants to address them, that would be great. This one is just, how close might we be to cellulosic butanol? That would be a major help with auto fuel. So, just transportation issues. So I don't know if anybody wants particularly to talk about what the role could be. I suppose we could have talked about that all night, but anybody in particular want to jump in to talk about cellulosic butanol or transportation other than what's already been said? No? Okay, well, sorry, person who asked that. All right, here's the last question. It seems like storms, droughts, so forth haven't acted as significant enough flashpoints for real action on climate change, similar to what 9/11 did for national security. What kind of flashpoint will need to happen in order to spark real action? Anybody want that one? Go ahead.
Well, go ahead. I think the best thing that we can do as a community is people do get complacent, and that's a true statement. But the best time to act is right after a storm, and neighbors are in that moment of generosity, and everyone comes together after a disaster. And so when those opportunities come up, and you just kind of have to take advantage of them, and not maybe bring other buzzwords into the picture, but say, this is happening right now, and to take action immediately, and that's, I think, the best path forward to make something happen.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to take a shot at that one, and that is, look, as recently as a couple years ago, you would hear scientists say, well, when an extreme weather event occurs, this is consistent with models, but, we're not going to pin any individual weather event on climate change. If you read the scientific literature, that's changing. We're seeing more and more articles that, in fact, are doing probabilistic studies, and they're looking at individual events and saying, what is the likelihood that this event would have occurred if we didn't have an Earth that was out of whack in terms of its heat balance? And I'll give you an example. Last July, the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society had a fairly lengthy article by a number of authors, and they looked at 7 extreme weather events that occurred throughout the world in 2011. And they tried to estimate what's the likelihood these would have occurred if we didn't have all this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And out of those 7 events, they only concluded that one of them likely would have occurred anyway. And so it's very difficult to say, obviously the 9/11 was an extreme event. And it's very difficult to say, gee, we're going to see a weather event that has that kind of an impact. But I do think we're going to see more and more events like Hurricane Sandy. Look, New York had Hurricane Irene just the year before that with major damage. And then Hurricane Sandy came right after it. So what we're seeing is 100-year events happening every 5 years. I think that eventually is going to tip the scale, because unfortunately, that's going to continue to get worse.
Great, thank you. All right, now we're going to wrap up with closing statements, and again, to kind of be fair, I'm going to start with Ms. Hannah and Ms. Frank, and we'll move up this way. So go ahead, you have 3 minutes for a closing statement.
My closing statement is going to be very short and closed. I wanted to say that we at Carson are really focused on not just the quality of the energy, waste, and water reductions. We're not just focused on working with NREL and CERL and those other entities to try these innovative technologies. We've made great strides in that area, but also in the quantity. We have, I believe we have 240 LEED certified buildings on post, which is the greatest concentration in Colorado of an entity.
To add to that, yes, we have a large quantity. We have so many innovative technologies, some that have worked beautifully and some that have not. So we have so many lessons learned that we would like to share with you. And we have more construction in our future and more goals to reach in our future to help us meet that goal. So if you would like to talk to us afterward to learn more about specific technologies or to share your ideas with us, we're open to that.
First of all, I want to thank everyone else for coming tonight. I want to thank all my fellow panelists. It's actually been really interesting. We have laws in this country that prohibit discrimination based on age. So I'm going to take exception with my friend Ms. Bassett's comment earlier about fossil fuels and the fact that they're so old and why are we using them. We're using them because they are affordable and they are abundant and they are accessible and they provide very important baseload power that allows us to keep these lights on and these microphones mostly working. And you know, I talked a lot about the things we're doing to kind of reduce our carbon footprint and to promote wiser, more efficient use of energy at the retail level and the wholesale level. But, and I also talked, I think, a little bit about all the new renewable resources that we're building. We have a new RFP out for more renewables, and that was before the law passed the state legislature today. So we were doing a lot with renewables to address concerns over climate change. But we're going to continue to use fossil fuels. Like I said, they're abundant, they're affordable, they're reliable, they're accessible, and they're important because we have growing energy needs in this country. And we need a steady, reliable source of electricity. Now, in 200 or 300 years, we're going to run out of coal. And by then, you know, we'll have these things figured out and we'll have alternative sources. But I just want to talk a little bit about what we're doing to continue to use fossil fuels, but to do that responsibly. Because addressing the carbon footprint issue is not just about bringing on more renewables, it's how do you use your current fossil fuels more responsibly. And as I mentioned earlier, we're investing in carbon utilization and carbon sequestration, research and development. We're part of a partnership with the states of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, and we're evaluating the geological structures in northern Colorado for their kind of viability to safely and economically store carbon dioxide in the long term. We're evaluating an integrated energy test center that would make an asset out of carbon, so it's carbon utilization. You're not burying it in the ground, but you're making something useful out of it, monetizing it, so people really have incentive. You want to know what that climactic event's going to be? It's going to be when you can monetize efficiencies and monetize uses of carbon and take it out of the atmosphere that way. That's, at least in this country, that's always going to motivate people, is that profit motive. We're making not only are we promoting energy efficiency at the consumer level, but we're making our own facilities more efficient. Coal plants can be more efficient. Transmission lines can be more efficient in terms of shedding less energy, getting more power out of the same amount of fuel. Some of our turbine rotor projects at our coal plants have allowed us to save energy equivalent to powering the power you would need to power 10,000 homes. So we're doing things with our existing facilities. 2 years ago, we purchased a combined cycle natural gas power plant in Fort Lupton. That allows us to capture waste heat. One of our coal plants on the West Slope burns coal more efficiently through atmospheric circulating fluidized bed combustion. So we're finding ways to use fossil fuels more responsibly in addition to investing in renewables. And I think that's all part of the all of the above energy strategy, is finding ways to use everything more responsibly.
I'm going to take a little different tack. You know, I think in the opening remarks that KK mentioned and have come up in some of your questions, there is the question out there how to make progress on this and somehow well, to make progress on this issue that we recognize of the changing climate. And, you know, we've seen over recent years difficulties in making any progress, it seems, in this country at the national level, given gridlock in politics and whatnot. So, rather than despair, it does seem to me that it still comes down to individual choices that we make. And especially in this country, in the United States, which has had the benefit of a high economic level and access to resources that we are used in our economic engine and whatnot. At Fort Collins Utilities, we have reason, in our building analysis activities, we often are looking at what are the patterns that we see. And I don't know whether this will seem surprising or not, but sometimes we'll be looking at the energy usage in, let's say, a 4-plex apartment. And all 4 units are identical, but one is using 500 kilowatt hours a month, and the other is using 80. You know, a 4 to 5 times difference. And, you know, we work with some of the folks in units like this, and it's not like one is not there or living in the dark with the heat turned off. It's just, Drew mentioned, and everyone in the utility industry recognizes, there is more stuff in our homes now than there used to be. And average electricity use goes up for that reason. So I would ask you to jot down this following thing to look up on the internet: the 2,000 watt society. It's a concept out of Switzerland of what would be the average energy budget that everyone on the planet, if they adhered to, you know, we could balance and not be producing more greenhouse gases than we're sequestering and so forth and so on. And basically, it was the Swiss analysis of where would be a balance point for this planet that at least would, in terms of energy use, that might lead to a sustainable scenario. Well, so, not surprisingly, the developing world typically consumes energy at a level that's below that 2,000 watt number. And you'll have to read the article to understand exactly what 2,000 watts means. Europe, they would have to cut their use by about 4 to 5 or 6 times to get down to this level, and we in the United States and Canada would have to cut our use by maybe 10 or 11 times. It basically is the challenge out there. You know, sustainability, you know, mitigating climate change is about taking a look at our choices and possibly at least heading in the direction towards, you know, I guess the way I would put it is maybe less stuff and a better outcome. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. This is obviously a critical issue, and as one of the questions earlier, we have seen a change in the attitude of the public, understanding that this is not just some crazy enviro liberals making up stuff about the climate changing. So we have moved a lot in understanding, and I think that's why we will see more action. And I want to applaud the Fort Collins Utilities, for those of you who don't know, as one of the strongest energy efficiency programs of any of the utilities in the state of Colorado. So there are examples. Efficiency is going to be critical in the answer. And I have to tease Drew a little bit. Now, there are a lot of people who, instead of iPods, still listen to a record player, but that's what I'm saying.
That's plugged in also.
Yes, it's plugged in. But so, yeah, obviously fossil fuels are not going to disappear tomorrow, but that's why I quoted the report from NRAL looking at why not go with the technology. And we know we could be at the technologies there, and you pointed out the report as well, to be at 80% renewables by 2050. So my son was born in the year 2000, so yes, on his 50th birthday, that, you know, that's not out of the question as an objective, but we do need to move forward then with the policies and create the system. And also look at, you know, there was discussion about the affordability of fossil fuels. Well, it's affordable because we don't have a carbon tax. We don't have, I mean, when you look at the prices in Europe, where they pay the true cost, it's not affordable. Because if we took all the costs that I was mentioned that are placed on the taxpayer and the communities and is not being paid by the industry, If that was switched over and paid by the industry, the affordable would not be what we would know it as. So there's a lot of accountability that is not currently how our structure is as far as things like carbon taxes that you see in other countries.
So for me, the importance of doing environmental work is ultimately about people. The most vulnerable populations, those that are going to pay the price for all of our stuff with their health and their safety, are usually the poorest among us and the people of color. It's important that we improve the environment, but it's also important that we don't do that on the backs of low-wage workers, and that we not only think about how we can clean up our planet, but also how we can create good jobs as we do it.
I'd like to come back to these 2020 goals again, because they were recently released. I talked about two of them, the energy goal and the greenhouse gas goal, but I want to mention some others because these are all interrelated, and many of them collectively will help us achieve what we need to in greenhouse gas reduction. We have a mobility goal. We'd like to reduce the number of trips made in single occupancy vehicles in Denver to 60% from north of 70 where they are right now. We'd like to produce, have 20% of the food purchased in Denver in 2020 be produced and processed in Colorado instead of about 1%, which it is today. We want our new development to be directed to urban centers. We want to build the density that Amanda referred to earlier, and not just around transit stops, because those are, light rail stops, because those are limited. We need to build more affordable housing, and we need to measure that not only in terms of the cost of the housing, but also the cost of the transportation related to where that housing is relative to jobs. Currently, Denver, 60% of Denver neighborhoods are rated affordable by the Center for Neighborhood Technologies using their H+T index, which includes transportation. 60%, which, and I don't know whether to laugh or cry, that puts us in the top 10 cities in the United States. But we'd like it to be 80%. We actually have a workforce goal, which almost no urban sustainability programs have. And it doesn't just involve training people for jobs, but we want, by 2020, we want 90% of the workers in Denver to be able to get to their jobs with a transit commute of 90 minutes. That sounds like 90 minutes one way on transit, that sounds ridiculous, but under a study by the Brookings Institution last year, only 45% of Americans can do that now. So we want to hit 90% in Denver. We don't want a car to be a prerequisite to a job. And finally, we want to reduce the amount of material going to our landfills by 20%. These are remarkable goals, but they're just goals. The key isn't really the goal, it's the achievement. And achievement is going to require backbone from our elected officials. And ladies and gentlemen, our elected officials get their backbone from you. So when Mayor Hancock goes out on a limb and announces some of the most ambitious sustainability goals in the country, it's important that he not be greeted by thunderous silence. He needs to hear from you. If you like him, just drop him a note. If you want members of council to back them up, drop them a note. If you think they don't go far enough, write about that. And yes, if you think they go too far, you can write about that as well. But ultimately, the outcome of what we're trying to do with greenhouse gas emissions is in your hands. And one of the things you can put in your hands is a pen and a piece of paper. Thank you.
Well, I think I'd like to use my closing remarks to dispel a myth. One thing you may hear skeptics say is, okay, climate change is a big problem, but it's an enormous problem, and you know what? We can't afford to address it. It's too expensive. So I'd like to address that. In 2010, and I guess the point I'm going to make here is that there is a cost of not addressing climate change, and that's the thing you don't often hear about. In 2010, the National Academy of Sciences did a study. This is not an environmental group. This is the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and they looked at our current energy system, our fossil fuel energy system, and they looked at the environmental damage and the cost to our economy of that damage, not including climate change effects. That report estimated that our current fossil fuel economy costs the U.S. $120 billion per year in environmental damage. There was a study by Tufts University. They looked at the cost of climate change damage. What do we do? What is it going to cost the U.S. to clean up the damage from droughts, crop failures, wildfires, flooding, etc.? That study estimated by the year 2025, it will cost the U.S. economy $270 billion per year, all right? That's by 2025. That's not so far in the distant future. Add those two together, you're talking the cost of not addressing climate change approaching $500 billion a year to the United States economy. The British government commissioned Nicholas Stern, former chief economist of the World Bank, to do a study of the cost of mitigating climate change. He estimated the cost of mitigating it, doing something about it, is 1% of the world's gross domestic product. The cost of cleaning up the damages and not mitigating it, 5 to 20% of the world's gross domestic product. The American Solar Energy Society did a study looking at how we can address carbon emissions. And it looked at the various wedges for reducing carbon emissions. The biggest wedge was energy efficiency. As Jerry mentioned, you don't want to do renewable energy without energy efficiency. All right? Why is that? It's because energy efficiency actually saves you money. And in fact, studies have shown that if you deploy renewable energy and energy efficiency at the same time, the cost savings from efficiency can pay for the renewable energy. So when you hear this point that we can't afford to address climate change, my response would be we can't afford not to address climate change. The course we're on now is the most expensive thing we can be doing in this economy.
Well, that wraps up our roundtable tonight. I want to thank Bryce for organizing all this. I want to thank all of you for coming out. And finally, I want you to help me join in thanking our panel for sharing their expertise with us. I think some of them can stay a little bit if any of you have final questions. But otherwise, good night and have a safe walk, ride, drive, transport home.